Hi everyone, I'm Kelly Kivlin, a curator here at Dia Art Foundation, and it's great to see everyone. Well, it's a really special occasion to have Rayyane with us tonight. He is opening a show tomorrow at the Met, so I think it's a testament to his dedication to know he's here, giving us his time and his thoughts on Smithson. Before I begin, I just want to thank the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs for their generous support of the program, and also, of course, the Brooklyn Brewery. And my colleagues, where are they? Max, Tanone, Andrea Lavilla, Sally Hughes, for their assistance with tonight's program. And also to the Emily Harvey Foundation, of course, for hosting tonight's event. It's an honor to have Rayyane speaking on the work of Smithson, an artist, of course, who Dia has championed for a long time now, both in our collection up at Dia Beacon, as well as our stewardship of Spiral Jetty. It is now my pleasure to speak more about Rayyane. He's an artist who lives and works in Beirut and also San Francisco. He received his bachelor's degree in architecture from Cooper Union and a master's of fine arts from the University of California, San Diego. Drawing from his personal experience of research, Tabet utilizes the individual narrative in order to offer an alternative understanding of major sociopolitical events. And this is often informed, of course, by his training in both architecture and sculpture, as well as his investigations that really look into the slippage between history and the built environment. He's opening, as I mentioned, a show tomorrow night at the Met titled Rayyane Tabet, Alien Property. And the work in the show very much articulates the history and story of the 9th century BCE stone reliefs excavated in the early 20th century at Tel Halluf, Syria, and their subsequent destruction, loss, or dispersal to museum collections around the world, including the Met. His upcoming exhibitions also include Rayyane Tabet, 1858, 1958 and 2058 at the Walker Art Center, opening in December. It's a really busy season for you. And Arabesque at Storefront for Art and Architecture, which opens in January of 2020. I'm sorry, December 9, 2019 is the Walker. And is that correct? 2020. Okay, so I did get it right. And Storefront is this January 2020. And recently at Parasol Unit in London, the Louvre in Paris, and Quai d'Art in Nimes, Kunstverein in Hamburg, and the Witte de With Center for Contemporary Art in Rotterdam. Well, thank you again for being here, and please join me in welcoming Rayyane Tabet.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Kelly, for the invitation. I'd also like to thank Catherine Atkins at DIA, Lisa Lefebvre at the Holt Smithson Foundation, and Jack Oviat for their help in writing this talk. All aerial photos that you will see tonight were taken at an eye altitude set 3,000 feet above each location, so that the sites are comparable in scale. The Spiral Jetty is an earthwork, a film, and an article by Robert Smithson. I'll be referencing and quoting from all three of these works during this talk, so things might get a little confusing at times. Please bear with me.
The Earth's history seems at times like a story recorded in a book, each page of which is torn into small pieces. Many of the pages and some of the pieces of each page are missing.
One minute into the 1970 movie Spiral Jetty, Robert Smithson says, "The Earth's history seems at times like a story recorded in a book, each page of which is torn into small pieces. Many of the pages and some of the pieces of each page are missing. In the 1972 article Spiral Jetty, Smithson writes, "I wanted Nancy Holt to shoot the Earth's history in 1 minute for the movie. I wanted to treat the above quote as a fact. So we drove out to the Great Notch Quarry in New Jersey, where I found a quarry facing about 20 feet high. I climbed to the top and threw a handful of ripped up pages from books and magazines over the edge while Nancy filmed it. Some ripped pages from an old atlas blew across a dried out, cracked mud puddle." On July 20th, 1973, Robert Smithson died in a plane crash while flying over one of his earthworks that was under construction at the time in a lake near Amarillo, Texas. He was 35 years old. The earliest aerial photograph of the Spiral Jetty, available through Google Earth Pro's Historical Image View, a tool that allows one to go through a timeline of photographs over a particular site, was taken on June 25, 1993. It is attributed to the United States Geological Survey, which studies the landscape of the nation, its natural resources, and the potential hazards that threaten it. The last available aerial photograph was taken almost 24 years later to the day, on June 30th, 2017. Besides the shift from black and white to color, the photograph appeared at first to be quite similar. But between the first image and the last, much had happened. In 1999, Spiral Jetty entered the collection of Dia Art Foundation. And in 2002, after nearly 30 years underwater and following seasons of extreme drought, Spiral Jetty resurfaced. About 1 mile north of the oil seeps, I selected my site. Irregular beds of limestone dip gently eastward. Massive deposits of black basalt are broken over the peninsula, giving the region a shattered appearance. Spiral Jetty was made in 1970 from 6,000 tons of black basalt rocks that were scooped up from the beach at the beginning of the jetty by the front loader, then deposited in the trucks, whereupon the trucks backed up to the outline of stakes and dumped the material. The basalt deposits that Smithson used from the site were rich in volcanic sediment. The rocks were available, they did not need to be quarried, and more importantly, they were free. Great Salt Lake, where the spiral jetty is located, was historically part of Lake Bonneville, a prehistoric lake that dates back to the Ice Age and stands as a record of the geological formation of its surroundings. In choosing to repurpose basalt from the area, Smithson extended the life of his work beyond the time of its making. Basalt is the single most abundant volcanic rock on the planet. It underlies most of Earth's surface and its ocean floors. So, within the history of basalt lies the history of the Earth. It is also found on the Moon, on Mars, and on Venus. Basalt is present all around us, in volcanoes and in mines, in quarries and in gravel pits, in statues, in tombs, in grinding pots, in thrones, in cobblestones, in ballasts, tools, pedestals, temples, amphitheaters, archways, columns, rocks, stones, earthworks, and meteorites. So, if we were to date the spiral jetty geologically, it would become part of this continuum of works made out of basalt that together create a spectrum for viewing the Earth's history as a series of distinct historical, economic, social, political, and environmental events featuring the rock at their core. The Watchung Mountains are a parallel groups of 3 long and low ridges in northern New Jersey. They were formed out of successive volcanic eruptions that flooded the Newark Basin with basalt. The area, rich in the mineral, became a prized extraction site, leading to the establishment of several quarries along the slopes of the mountains at the turn of the 20th century. One of them was the Great Notch Quarry. In May 1966, Smithson visited the Great Notch Quarry for the first time. In an article from that year, titled Crystal Land, he writes, "The quarry resembled the moon. The walls did look dangerous, cracked, broken, shattered. The walls threatened to come crashing down. Fragmentation, corrosion, decomposition, disintegration, rock creep, debris slides, mud flow, avalanche were everywhere in evidence. The gray sky seemed to swallow up the heaps around us. Fractures and faults spilled forth sediment, crushed conglomerates, eroded debris and sandstone. It was an arid region, bleached and dry, an infinity of surfaces spread in each direction. A chaos of cracks surrounded us." On a winter day in 1968, Smithson returned to the Great Notch Quarry. This time, he came prepared. He snuck in and propped 2 long rectangular mirrors back to back between basalt rock plateaus to form a bridge that reflected both the sky and the ground. He took 4 photographs of this makeshift composition, which he titled Mirror Span, Great Notch Quarry, Montclair, New Jersey. In the early 1970s, the Great Notch Quarry ceased operation due to a family dispute. Today, the site of the former quarry is a parking lot on the campus of Montclair State University, the 2nd largest university in New Jersey. Tel Halluf is an archaeological site and a village in northeast Syria, which sit on the border with Turkey. The village is famous for the archaeological dig led by Baron Max von Oppenheim, a German diplomat and amateur archaeologist who, between 1911 and 1929, discovered an entire Neo-Hittite city hidden under the plains of Tel Halluf. His greatest discovery was a palace whose facade included a 9-meter-high portico of gods standing on animals and a burial ground with several large-scale works, all sculpted in basalt. Following the division of the finds with the authorities of the French mandate stationed in Syria and in Lebanon, Oppenheim took the lion's share back to Germany and established his own museum, a private institution known as the Tel Halluf Museum, housed in a former factory in Berlin. On November 22, 1943, the Tel Halluf Museum in Berlin was hit by a phosphorus bomb. With temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, all the artifacts were destroyed, except for objects made from basalt due to the volcanic's rock ability to withstand heat. But when firefighters came to douse the flames, the sudden temperature change between the hot stone and the cold water shattered all the artifacts. Despite logistical difficulties, the director of Berlin's Museum of the Ancient Near East managed to crate the shattered fragments on behalf of Oppenheim, and in August 1944, 9 truckloads full of rubble were brought to the cellars of the Pergamon Museum to await an uncertain fate. After the war, the Berlin Wall divided the Pergamon Museum, which was situated in the east, from the burnt-out Tel Halluf Museum, which was located in the west. So nothing could be done with fragments housed in a museum on one side, but owned by a family living on the other. It was only after the reunification of Germany in 1990 that an agreement allowed restorers to handle the basalt fragments. The reconstruction project of the Tel Halluf remains began in August of 2001. 27,000 basalt fragments were laid out on 200 wooden pallets. 10 years later, 25,000 fragments had been reassembled into 30 sculptures and architectural elements. Fractures remained visible, with no attempt made to disguise them, and molten glass from the roof of the destroyed Tel Halluf Museum in Berlin was left on the surface of all the sculptures. The 2,000 remaining fragments that could not be identified or matched against anything are held in several crates and cabinets in the storage rooms of the Pergamon Museum, which is undergoing a major renovation due to be completed in 2035. When that day will come, the restored facade of the ruler's palace of Tel Halluf will serve as the entrance to the ancient Near East collection in Berlin. Meanwhile, the conservators at the National Museum of Aleppo are piling up sandbags around the plaster replica of that same facade, while they wait for a lull in the war in Syria. In 2016, I started working on a multi-part series of sculptures and installations that looked at the fate of the objects uncovered at Tel Halluf and the complex and contradictory work of Max von Oppenheim. I was particularly interested in the fact that the destruction of most of these artifacts that came from Tel Halluf happened in Berlin and not in Aleppo, challenging the common assumption that artworks are safer in the West. I was also interested in the material quality of these works and how they survived the fire because they had been made out of basalt, but ultimately shattered because of a thermal shock. During my research, I got in touch with Nadia Kolidis and Lutz Martin, two conservators at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, who had been part of the team that worked on the reconstruction of the shattered artifact, and asked if I could get access to the 2,000 unidentified fragments that could not be pieced back together. They were surprised that I was interested in these pieces more than I was interested in the reconstructed works. For them, these had been the sign of the shortcomings of their project, a sort of archaeological leftover. But for me, there was something important in being able to see what once was the interior of a sculpture that had become exposed following a historical and thermal event. I learned from Nadia and Lutz that these unidentified fragments had become sort of a temporal mindfuck. The fragments all presumably came from within Neo-Hittite sculptures, so technically they should be dated as being from the 9th to 10th century BC. But since a work is usually dated based on the tool marks on it, and in the absence of these tool marks on their surface, these works had to be dated also geologically, which meant taking them back to around 350 million years. And since the original sculptures had been destroyed during World War II, the conservators had to acknowledge that event as part of the dating of these objects. Similarly, they had to acknowledge the fact that they had tried to piece them together and couldn't, so their restoration date now had to feature as part of the history of the work. They were suddenly confronted with an object made from a stone 350 million years old, carved between the 9th and 10th century BC, destroyed in 1943, and attempted to be reconstructed between 2001 and 2010. A single object with 4 different timelines: a geological timeline, an archaeological timeline, a historical timeline, and a technical timeline. In January 2017, I was given access to the storerooms of the Pergamon Museum and was allowed to make charcoal rubbings of every single one of these 2,000 unidentified fragments. I had 1 minute per stone, so the process quickly became mechanical. I would wrap a piece of paper around the stone and would try to lift as much texture as possible from its surface. The device used to show these pieces consisted of a series of wooden pallets laid out in a grid. It mirrored the system used by the conservators while sorting through the basalt fragments. One of the main discoveries at Tel Halluf was the statue of a seated figure, carved out of a single block of basalt. It measured 2 meters in height, 1 meter in depth, and 1 meter in width. It weighed more than 4 tons. The figure took center stage in the entrance of the Tel Halluf Museum in Berlin and became one of the main attractions there. It was Max von Oppenheim's favorite work. He used to call her his Venus and requested in his will that his headstone be a copy of the bottom half of the figure. It was also one of the many pieces that had been painstakingly put back together by the restorers at the Pergamon, with no attempt made to hide its shattered aspect, and molten bitumen from the ceiling of the destroyed museum was left on the surface of the sculpture. I have been very intrigued by this figure, its minimal formal aspect, the fact that its gender remains unknown, and that it too bore the scars of its own history. So I decided to look for quarries where I could source basalt to make a replica of it. This is when I first learned about the Abu Hassan Quarry in Sharjah, Syria. Sharjah is a city 87 kilometers south of Damascus, in the As-Suwaida Governorate. As-Suwaida, from the Arabic aswad, meaning black, was named after the color of the abundant basalt rock of the surrounding areas. In 244 AD, Philip the Arab, a Roman emperor that hailed from Sharjah, planned to build a replica of Rome in his native city. He commissioned a temple, a triumphal arch, baths, a basilica, and a theater to be erected there. Since basalt was readily available in the region, all the structures were built using this material, which gave them a peculiar black color, in stark contrast with the regular white marble used for most Roman construction. When Philip the Arab died in 249, all construction was halted, and the buildings were left unfinished. Nevertheless, the project secured basalt's use as a common building material. The high demand for it in the region and elsewhere led to the establishment of several quarries that operated for centuries. In 2017, I was invited to produce a work for a show in Rotterdam. The work originally consisted of a single block of basalt measuring 2 cubic meters, quarried at the Abu Hassan Quarry, which had become, by then, the last operating basalt quarry in Syria. Because the embargo on Syria, I could not ship the basalt to Holland, so the solution was to cut the block into 1 square foot tiles and smuggle them to Lebanon, where their paperwork was altered, and they continued their journey to Holland as tiles for the renovation of a kitchen. When they arrived to Rotterdam, the tiles replaced the floor of the gallery, and foil pressings I had made earlier in the storerooms of the Pergamon by molding pieces of aluminum directly onto the reconstructed seated figure were installed on pedestals on top. The troubled trajectory of the tiles across national and international borders was represented by the inclusion of shipping documents in the gallery. But the wolf, as always, was waiting at the doorstep. In July 2018, members of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, besieged the city of Shahba, targeting members of the Druze community, a religious minority group that had lived in the area. They set up their command center in the Abu Hassan Quarry. The site was chosen for its strategic location on a hilltop, from where the entire area could be surveyed. The siege led to the Aswada offensive, a 3-month-long battle between ISIS and the Syrian armed forces, which ended in the Battle of As-Safa, when the last pocket of ISIS fighters was surrounded in a large volcanic field of basalt. Throughout history, many communities and tribes had used the As-Safa basaltic hills as a place of refuge from war and during times of adverse environmental conditions. In 2006, a team of German and Syrian excavators went back to Tel Halluf to continue the work that Max von Oppenheim had left behind 77 years earlier. They went back again 5 more times until their expedition was cut short in 2011 with the start of the uprisings and the subsequent civil war in Syria. When I inquired about the fate of the Tel Halluf archaeological site from Lutz Martin, the conservator at the Pergamon Museum who had been in charge of the excavation there, he told me that a group of locals had reburied the site in order to protect it from bombs. He also showed me a photograph of men shoveling sand and rock into the ground with a note that read, "We're waiting for you to come back soon and uncover it all over again." The last available aerial photograph of Tel Halluf on Google Earth Pro was taken on August 24th, 2018. It's attributed to a Colorado-based space technology company, Maxar Technologies, Inc., which specializes in manufacturing communication, observation, radars, and other satellites. A day after that image was taken, on August 25th, 2018, Marwa Arsanios, an artist and a friend, sent me a 35-second video of Tel Halluf. The video had been taken from the Turkish side of the border, an area that was until very recently under the governance of the People's Protections Unit, a primarily Kurdish militant group and the main component of the Syrian Democratic Forces.
برغامون موجود الآثار هيدي هون.
نعم لا خربان عملوا نسخ تقليد منها حلب راح
أروح
In September 2018, Kelly Kivland invited me to take part in the Artists on Artists series. We quickly settled on Robert Smithson's spiral jetty, primarily because of the material it had been made out of, and the fact that I had spent the last few years investigating this material and its various properties. As I started writing this talk, I realized that my interest in basalt was far from being formal. While I read this to you today, the fate of the people and the places I have mentioned in this talk is uncertain. and all I'm left with is the question that with technological advancements generating ever clearer aerial images of our world, why is it then that the history of the earth feels muddier, blurrier, dirtier, and more pixelated than ever? Thank you.
Get too close to the speaker. I want to open it up for some questions. Ryan is actually being generous and allowing us to respond. While I give you some time to think, I couldn't help but taking note of the video clip here. So Smithson running along the spiral, sort of man conquering or sort of owning the land, and thinking also about entropy, of course, both the forces of entropy by man, but also by nature. I just wonder if you can maybe speak a little bit about that in terms of if that, or if you consider that at all while you were writing this piece.
Yeah, it was kind of, I think I told you this, Kelly, in private, but I think if I had done this talk maybe like 2 years ago, I would have chosen the same artist and the same artwork, but it would have been a completely different talk. And I would have probably, venerated Smithson more and talked maybe more along the lines of kind of entropy. What was very interesting in kind of my recent investigation is kind of this shift into trying to look for lack of a better word, the kind of the political that's hidden within the material, rather than to kind of close down the discourse around certain figures and certain artworks within particular discussions. And so in a way, as much as there was kind of a desire within me to follow kind of in the lineage of discussing Smithson work with those guidelines, I felt kind of interestingly liberated when I realized that I could somehow, I had the freedom to reframe this, not only the piece, but also some of the discourse around it. That being said, when I was doing research on the thermal shock that had happened in World War II in the pieces at the museum, I think it was it's very. In order to escape the kind of the political reality of that event, I started thinking more along the lines of entropy there, and formalism, and dealing with these as just material, not, even when I was making the rubbings, I was like, okay, I just don't think about what is it that you're touching, why is it that you're here, why is it that they're here, so it's kind of like this, I don't know if I'm making any sense, but it's kind of like a reversal, right, where I would have a tendency to think kind of formally, materially, entropically about the spiral jetty. And I have recently been interested in connecting it to a larger discourse, and all the while finding the entropic elsewhere in order to maybe help keep sane in each of these areas.
Thank you. Anybody else? Do you mind if I bring the mic by?
Thank you so much Thank you so much for your fascinating talk and sharing your work. I'm really interested in the question of scale, and I think you talked about that a lot in terms of time and the way sort of basalt is this compression of kind of vast scales of time, but I'm interested also how you think about it in terms of space, because I think with your sequence of aerial photos, there's this sense of a particular scale there, but then with your rubbings, there's this incredibly intimate physical proximity to the art. And so I'm curious just to say a bit more, you kind of showed it visually and materially, but I'd love to hear how you think about the scale of space.
Yeah. One of the, when it was kind of interesting when I started kind of sequencing even the images for the talk, that one way that could, again, I think it's these different layers or levels of abstraction. In order for me to allow myself to do a jump from Utah to Sharjah, which sounded like a very far leap to make. The fact that I could access all of these aerial photographs, but the fact that I could also freeze them at a certain kind of scale allowed me to kind of a level of abstraction. So I think kind of this, in terms of the kind of, as much as it comes again with its own loaded, the loaded nature, for example, like one of the very strange and perverse moments that happen when you go through Google Earth's historical timeline is you realize that we have clearer images of Syria after the beginning of the Civil War. If you look back and you look at the entire world, we usually have a clearer, sharper image after wars, which is, that's kind of one. So this idea of kind of freezing them at the same scale, treating them kind of similarly, allowed for a certain distance. Now, in terms of kind of the making of the work, and I could speak more about like not only the process, but I've always been interested in processes that start at a very kind of like intimate and kind of human scale. It's kind of one stone, one rubbing, or one composition. But then it's, you know, by virtue of the repetition of the act, which I always say, you know, ultimately after, you know, when you do one rubbing or 10 rubbings, you're just like, okay, but when you do 2000s, you're completely also out of yourself, you know, so that distance that's allowed by the process that starts extremely intimate, very emotional, but through the act of repetition somehow allows for another level of kind of abstraction or kind of getting away from yourself. So that's in the moment of the making. But then in the installation, for example, of a work like Basalt Shards, you know, the system is quite simple, the device is quite simple. It's the amount and the fact that you could take over a room any size with, you know, A4 pieces of paper, right? It allows for, once again, something that could be as inconsequential as a Euro palette and a piece of white paper to, you know, confront even the most daunting of spaces. So it's kind of, I think, these different layers of scale, of ways of working that I think have allowed me recently to be in the moment within, you know, the process as I'm making it, but also separate from it. And I definitely think that, you know, so the project concerning or following the Max von Oppenheim's dig that started in 2016 kind of shifted, I think, something within me, because it has allowed me to balance with more intention the kind of the personal and the private and the intimate with the kind of institutional and the historical, right? And I think scale has helped a lot with that.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you, Rayyane.
Thank you.